Welcome to a deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into some complex stuff. We've got these transcripts from what they call investigative hypnosis sessions.
Right.
And the topic, well, it's intense. Claims about Pope Francis's death, future prophecies for the church, the world, and some really, really esoteric details.
Exactly. But here's the fascinating part, and maybe the most crucial part for us today. The source material itself, it doesn't just give you the claims.
Okay.
It actually spends a lot of time talking about the information itself, like
Yeah.
how they get it, why they think it's super contaminated, and how their team tries to, filter it.
Ah, so it's meta.
Very meta. So our mission really is twofold. Yes,
Yeah.
we're going to unpack the dramatic claims from the session, but just as importantly, we need to understand how the source itself says we should approach this information, their own warnings, their own methodology.
Okay, got it. So unpacking the claims, but also unpacking the process of getting those claims. Let's dive in because, yeah, this sounds interesting. All right, let's start with the core claim about Pope Francis. The session mentions a specific date, April 25, 2025, and the perception on that date is it's pretty extraordinary. Pope Francis isn't just one person.
That's the perception described, yeah. The session participant apparently saw two distinct entities. One, identified as 100% human Pope Francis,
Okay.
and the other, perceived as a human reptilian hybrid clone. Similar look, they said, but different DNA.
Whoa, a human reptilian hybrid clone. That's quite a start. And on that date, April 25th, 2025, what about the human Pope Francis? What's his status according to the session?
Perceived as deceased. Gone. The source mentions the session located his body in a coffin under the Vatican, second floor down specifically.
Second floor. Okay, but wait, April 2025, the source claims he died before that, right?
Much earlier. Yeah, that's a key point they make. The claim is the human Pope Francis actually died back in September 2024.
September 24. Wow. And the cause?
Heart attack. Perceived as natural causes. The source just knows he didn't hold up.
So, okay. If he supposedly died in September 24, why on earth would the announcement be planned for Easter Monday, April 21st, 2025? That's like a 7-month delay. What's the logic there, according to the source?
Well, the source interprets this as very deliberate, planned. They actually call it a double ritual.
A double ritual.
Yeah, with a double effect.
Yeah.
Part of it is the shock, obviously, big news on a huge religious day. But they also see it as manipulation, maybe to distract people, maybe even some kind of programming for religious followers.
Okay, so in this scenario they're describing, what were the roles? The human pope versus the hybrid.
The human pope, according to the session, was mainly for visual, public appearances, newspapers, TV, the face everyone recognizes.
Right, and the hybrid, what's its job, especially after the human pope allegedly dies?
The hybrid is perceived as still active, still around then, described as an ouvrier, like a worker, handling paperwork, basically, following a program.
Just carrying out instructions.
Seems like it. Obeying something else, as the source puts it. Less important overall once the human counterpart is gone, having served its main purpose.
And they mentioned the hybrid wasn't quite suitable for constant public appearances.
Right. The perception was that the hybrid was not human enough for that. They mentioned specific things, the eyes described as dark, not human. The skin was bizarre.
And the behavior.
More like a robot, kind of artificial, not totally convincing as human up close, apparently.
Okay. And there was something about energetic effects from the death announcement.
Yeah, the session participant described seeing dark, gray, smoky energies leaving Earth after the announcement.
Leaving Earth.
Yeah, draining sorrow, destruction, loss, channeling it into specific locations, portals maybe. And this energy was perceived as feeding entities, reptilians, other humanoids connected to the, quote, system or religions.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot. Incredibly dense claims about what's supposedly happening behind the scenes. But the session didn't stop there, did it? It looked forward.
Exactly. And this is where they start tying these perceptions into existing prophecies and the future.
Like St. Malachi, I saw that mentioned.
Yep. The source brings up the prophecy of the popes. They claim it was written in 1139 by Archbishop St. Malachi,
Okay.
who, interestingly, is perceived in the session itself as having mixed DNA, humanoid, human, reptilian, and being able to get info from reptilian sources.
Huh. And the fact it was found centuries later in the Vatican archives.
Also part of the plan, according to the source, not an accident, discovered in the late 16th century as part of a program timed, they say, to prepare people or maybe manipulate or even deroute divert humanity.
Okay. So how does the session interpret Malachi's prophecy about the last pope and the great trouble leading to Rome's fall? When is this supposed to happen?
They don't see it as immediate. The timeline they point to is more like 2032 to 2035, that window.
And what does the end mean in this context, end of the world?
Not necessarily the world, but the end of the Catholicism program, as they call it. The whole hierarchical system, the popes, the money, the control, the manipulation, that structure.
And things get revealed.
Yeah, lots of revelations. Supposedly shocking for many. The atmosphere is described as becoming very dark, like hell compared to now, is how they put it.
And Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, how does that fit in? The destruction of the city on 7 hills.
Right. The session interprets that not as like bombs leveling Rome, more like a profound change or restructuring, driven partly by climate issues, fire, water mentioned.
So environmental change.
Yeah, leading to old structures being replaced by new things,
Right.
like autonomous connected cities. And they link this shift to changes happening deep under the Vatican 4 floors down.
4 floors. You mentioned the coffin was 2 floors down.
Right. This is deeper. And they say it's not just men down there. It's a kind of relay with the outside. It's all part of the end of this era's program, which means things need to be recreated, restarted.
Okay, so after Francis, or the perceived Francis entities, who comes next? Who's the next pope, according to this session?
The participant perceived the next pope as coming from the cold countries, Russian or Polish maybe, from Eastern Europe.
And his nature? Human.
Not entirely. Perceived as another hybrid, human reptilian DNA again, but this time perceived as more reptilian than human.
More reptilian. And what are his supposed intentions? His personality?
Described as sadistic, aware of his task and taking pleasure in it.
Sadistic. That's dark.
It is. His main goal, as perceived, is to fundamentally change the church's dogmas, les dogs. Why? To habituate man to something else, get people used to new ideas.
Like what kind of ideas?
Examples given were modifying rules on abortion, sexuality, suggesting no limit, changes around gender, relationships, sort of radical freedom maybe, but framed by the source as potential decadence.
Stating the purpose of all this change.
To modify, separate, destabilize humanity, shake up consciousness to access it more easily, faster.
How is he perceived initially, though? Does he come across as sadistic?
No, initially quite the opposite. Seen as much more modern, less rigid, more accessible, sympathetic, even attractive at first.
A kind of charm offensive.
Sort of. But then, as his perceived reign goes on, it gets darker, more morbid, somber.
Why the shift?
Because, according to the source, his ultimate aim is to integrate non-humans directly into the religion, present them as actual gods.
Present non-humans as gods. Based on what?
The rationale given is chillingly simple.
Right.
It is written, and after they will be the gods. That's the justification perceived.
Okay. Let's pull back a bit. What about the wider world, geopolitically? What does the source see happening after Pope Francis's alleged death?
Generally, more tension, more public manifestations, protests. War is described as a form of blackmail. Not necessarily a global explosion, but like a constant simmering, boiling.
Any specific conflicts mentioned?
Yes. Ukraine is seen continuing, maybe intensifying. Pope Francis's death doesn't really impact it, in this view. But Gaza and Israel, that's perceived as getting a little more violent.
More violent? Why?
It's framed almost as if his death acts as an overture, an opening, allowing things to escalate there, a perceived desire by some forces to just raise the area.
Grim. Okay, let's jump back to that 2032-2035 period. The time of revelations. What kind of information comes out?
A lot of information, apparently. And it's deliberately overwhelming, making it hard for people to know what's real and what's fake.
Yeah.
Designed to destabilize.
What's the nature of these revelations designed to destabilize?
A key element involves extraterrestrial help. Information and phenomena presented as coming from outside Earth, specifically designed to make people afraid because it's beyond their normal understanding.
And the future pope, the hybrid one, he's okay with this.
Satisfied with it, according to the source, as part of the project.
And this leads to redefining God.
That seems to be the core idea. The source claims they, the controllers, want God to be identified as these extraterrestrials.
What does this ET God look like, according to the session?
A humanoid figure, maybe a mix of human, reptilian, other DNA. Has powers, perceived as very tall, beautiful, convincing, powerful, dominating.
And they claim this is the God people have always worshipped.
That's the claim described. The same God, just revealed now in this form.
Will we finally find out where humanity came from?
Doesn't sound like it. The source suggests information about human origins will remain deliberately confusing, mixed up.
So what happens to existing religions? Catholicism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism?
The perception is they slowly extinguish, they collapse.
Yeah.
But then it adds they resume the torch otherwise.
Meaning?
Suggests they don't vanish completely, but morph into something else.
Yeah.
Leading into...
A new religion. Right, what's that based on?
One word, submission. Total, complete obedience to the new God, these powerful ET beings.
How's that different from current religions?
The source contrasts it by saying current religions still allow some freedom, this new one, no return back. Once you're in, you're in. Full obedience and the purpose. To put Earth and humanity sous cloche under a beltar. Total control.
How?
Through intense programming, indoctrination. Identifying people strongly with fear. It might seem new and exciting, the source notes, maybe even make people crazy because it's so different, so grand scale. Geopolitically, it allows control over things previously uncontrollable.
A single world religion.
That's the idea, a unique single faith. But the source also sees it as fundamentally the same religions that always existed, just repackaged.
Okay, looking even further ahead, say 10 years after that 2032-2035 period, what happens then?
Many more overt appearances of non-humans and advanced technologies appearing, explicitly given by these extraterrestrials. But here's the catch, according to the source. This technology, it's a lure, a trick, a lure.
A lure? For what?
To make humans think they have power, that they can do things faster, better. But the real goal is deeper consciousness manipulation.
Who gets affected by this?
Most people on Earth is the perception. Maybe those living very remotely are slightly spared initially, but they'll eventually feel the effects. Even people who don't believe any of this. They might be swayed or made to doubt by apparent miracles.
Okay, wow. We've gone from papal clones to hybrid popes, collapsing religions, ET gods, tech lures.
Yeah.
It's a journey.
It absolutely is. And right here, this is where the source material does something really critical. After laying out all this incredibly dramatic, almost unbelievable stuff, it basically hits the brakes and says, okay, now let's talk about whether you should believe any of this. They dedicate significant time to the reliability or profound lack of reliability of the very information they just presented.
So they give the wild story, then immediately warn you about the story.
Precisely. It's like handing you a treasure map and then saying, by the way, this map is probably mostly wrong, drawn in the dark, and possibly by someone unreliable.
That's quite the disclaimer.
Yeah.
Let's quickly backtrack to the rituals you mentioned. Around the death announcement, opening portals, what was the perceived goal there?
The source claims those rituals are about opening the Earth's doors even more, allowing things to be infiltrated to change the future.
Like what things?
Technologies, advancements, pushing humanity towards being more robot-like, hybridized with computers, androids, that kind of direction.
And there are other rituals mentioned involving genetics.
Yeah, playing with human genetics.
Yeah.
Trying to alter it with non-human DNA. They described a scene, person lying down, blood taken, reptilian DNA added, sometimes mentioning putting eggs, ouf, into the abdomen. Maybe attempts at reanimation.
Good heavens.
Other things too, like blood packs between humans to change their vision, their perception, dark stuff.
Okay, so against that backdrop, the source then gives its own analysis of how trustworthy any information from these sessions actually is. This is the really meta part.
It is, and their main point is incredibly blunt. They state flat out, there's no such thing as a perfectly reliable investigative hypnosis session. Information from just one session. They say it's very contaminated.
Very contaminated. Why? What are the reasons they give?
Multiple layers. First, they perceive information traveling across dimensions, densities, getting distorted along the way.
Okay.
Then it passes through consciousness as the operator, maybe other entities which can distort it, intentionally or not. And then, crucially, the person in hypnosis interprets everything through their own filters. Their mind, beliefs, culture, past lives. All of it colors the information.
They use some analogies, right, to make this clearer.
Yeah, good ones. Like trying to talk underwater when your voice is made for air, or using different languages that just don't translate well, or interpreting gestures where yes in one culture means no in another. The signal gets fundamentally warped.
So if it's that contaminated, what's the point? How do they use info from a single session? What's its value to them?
They're very clear. The value is not truth. It's not instruction. It's not about memorizing facts from the session. For them, it's just a vehicle.
A vehicle.
Yeah, means of transport. It helps them navigate to the client's actual esoteric problem so they can work on that problem directly. The information itself is just a tool to get to the target for their intervention work, not a reliable report on reality.
Which begs the question, if single sessions are so unreliable for finding truth, how do they do actual investigations? If they want to find out about, say, the Pope.
Well, that's where they describe a completely different process. Long, difficult, tiring. It requires, they say, many high sessions. Thousands, potentially.
Thousands.
Yes, with different hypnotized subjects, different operators. And according to them, the only information they consider reliable is what comes up consistently, the common elements, across a vast majority of all those sessions.
How much information is that? What percentage?
A very low percentage, they estimate. Maybe only 2 or 3% of everything gathered across thousands of hours.
Just 2 or 3%. And the rest? The other 97, 98%.
They call it garbage information. Spazzatura, that's their term. Just noise to be discarded for investigative purposes.
Wow. Are there other complications they mention?
Definitely. Like if you ask about someone or something the hypnotized person has no real connection to, you might just hit a wall, get nothing.
Or worse.
Or worse, you might get info from what they call cunning entities, pretending to be who you're asking about, feeding you disinformation for their own reasons.
So even within their own process, it's incredibly difficult. They compared it to news sources, didn't they?
Yeah, like preferring a major news agency. Annis was their example, over some tiny blog. The agency has more checks, more public validations. You might trust it more.
Even though you know it's still probably manipulated at higher levels.
Exactly. It's about relative reliability within a system acknowledged to have flaws.
So how do they manage investigating big topics then, given all this potential garbage?
They have to narrow it down. They conduct investigative cycles on restricted spaces, very specific themes. Their example was investigating just pedophilia within the Catholic Church, not the whole church structure at once. Trying to tackle huge topics is just too messy, too much contamination. They have to break it down into smaller puzzle pieces.
And the goal is to build a picture only from that tiny 2-3% of filtered common information.
That's the methodology they describe, yes. Build a coherent puzzle from just the verified, cross-referenced pieces.
Okay, so let's recap. We've explored these absolutely mind-bending claims: papal clones, hybrid successors, collapsing religions, ET gods, tech traps, dark rituals. Really extraordinary stuff.
But then, crucially, we've also heard directly from the source itself about why this kind of information, gathered this way, is seen by them as fundamentally unreliable on its own, highly contaminated, requiring immense filtering across potentially thousands of sessions just to find a tiny sliver of what they consider potentially valid data for their specific practical purposes.
So what's the takeaway for you listening to this? We've journeyed through some incredible reality-bending claims. But maybe the deepest part of this dive isn't just the claims themselves, but the source's own candid reflection on how incredibly hard it is to find reliable truth, especially in these unconventional information spaces.
It really leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? If the very sources making these extraordinary claims were also warning us so strongly about massive contamination and the need for extreme filtering and skepticism, what does that tell us about how we should approach any information, whether it's from alternative channels or even the information presented as solid fact in the mainstream? How do you sort through all the noise to find what feels like the signal?